and welcome to a fast and festive introduction to Azure Data Engineering services. In this video, I'll introduce you to some of the more popular Azure Data Engineering services that are available. Now, because I realize that various people have various ideas about which Azure services are actually Azure Data Engineering services, I've decided to focus on the ones required for the Microsoft Certified Azure Data Engineer Associate certification in this video. And that includes services such as Azure Stream Analytics, Azure Data Factory, Azure Data Lake Storage, Azure Databricks, and Azure Stream Analytics. Now, along the way, I will help with some jargon as well. In addition to that, I would also highlight where SQL Server experience can come in handy. Now, this year's Festive Tech Calendar is actually good for a good cause, because it intends to raise money for Girls Who Code. So, if you go on to the Festive Tech Calendar site, you will actually see a link for the Just Giving page. Now, I very kindly ask all of you who are watching this to give generously, because a lot of us professionals have spent a lot of time putting this material together for all of you. Now, because this is for charity, I've taken it upon myself to do two different bios this year. One is the professional version, which you will see shortly. The other one is a festive alternative with some humour inside it. So, if you want to watch that version, you can watch it at the end of the video. Anyway, enjoy! So, a bit about myself before we get started. My name's Kevin Chant. I'm a lead BI and analytics architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you can probably tell from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why some people think this is complicated. Now, I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95, and that's probably as much as I should say about that. And over that time, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil, and the health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that were in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. Now, over that time, I've also gained various certifications, like the old and the new style MCSE certifications. And more recently, I became a Microsoft Certified Azure Data Engineer Associate, which is fairly relevant for this video. And in addition to that, I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. Now, you can find me online in a few different places. For example, I'm on Twitter at Kev Chant. I'm on LinkedIn with a user-friendly URL of Kevin-Chant. I have my own blog, and I also have a GitHub site that has various repositories on there, which can be useful for some people, including some for Azure Synapse Analytics. For this video, I've decided to show the services in a similar order as how you would see them in Microsoft Solution Ideas, which tends to show the flow of data between various services in different stages. For example, as you can see here in this particular diagram, the data is taken from the source. It's then moved over to be ingested, followed by going over to the store stage. Then it's taken over to be prepared and trained, and then finally modeled and served. So I'll be going through some of the services in that particular order today in this video. Okay, let's start with services that are involved with ingesting data. And there's a few Azure Data Engineering services I want to introduce in this section that are involved with ingesting data. First of all, there's Azure Event Hubs and Azure IoT Hub, as you can see in this particular diagram. Now, both of these services sound very similar, and that it can be useful in different ways. Both Azure Event Hubs and Azure IoT Hub can be used to ingest streaming data. However, Azure Event Hubs is more commonly used to ingest streaming data from various applications, like Apache Kafka, which I will mention later in this video. Whereas Azure IoT Hub is more commonly used to ingest streaming data from IoT devices like sensors. Now, once the data has been ingested into either of these hub-based services, it can then be forwarded to another service for additional processing, such as Azure Stream Analytics, which is one of the more popular services used to process data from these hubs. Of course, alternatively, you can forward it to other services as well, as long as they got special what's called adapters set up, which are used to receive streaming data. Anyway, Azure Stream Analytics can be used to process the data from either of these services to detect both temporary or long-term anomalies. And to help with some jargon here, what I mean is it can detect if there's an anomaly that has happened straight away, or whether there's one that has started to happen gradually over time. And in addition to that, Azure Stream Analytics can prepare the data to be stored in a service, like Azure Data Lake Storage or Azure SQL Database. And in fact, it can even send data directly to Power BI to be used with operational reports. And within Azure Stream Analytics, you can decide how to process the data using a SQL-like language. So those of you with a SQL Server background may find this particular part of this service interesting. Now, the final service I want to cover in this section is Azure Data Factory, which is one of the more popular Azure Data Engineering services. It is a proven solution that is commonly used for ETL and ELT related tasks. Now, to help with a bit of jargon here, because obviously both of those sound similar, ETL stands for Extract Transform Load, whereas ELT stands for Extract Load Transform. It's just slightly different ways to receive the data and to load it efficiently into other services. Now, those of you with a SQL Server background can actually think of Azure Data Factory conceptually as a cloud-based version of SQL Server integration services. In reality, though, it is a very different service. And I can actually quickly show you how these services look now. So I will just quickly go over to Azure Event Hubs. Now, if I go down to the Entities section in Azure within the Azure Event Hub service in the Azure portal, you can see I actually define how the data is ingested here from the applications. Alternatively, if I want to declare how the data is ingested in Azure IoT Hub, I have to go down to the device management section. And as you can see immediately, it looks a bit more involved than how you do it in Azure Event Hubs. Now, if I look at Azure Stream Analytics and go down to the job topology section, you can see here that you have a section where you declare your inputs, and that's basically where the streaming data has come from, whether that's Azure Event Hubs or Azure IoT Hub, for example. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can use SQL-like language to decide how to organize the data that's been ingested into this service. And you do that in the query section here. And already, straight away, you can see familiar select into from syntax. And finally, you can decide where to send the output from whatever is being processed in Azure Stream Analytics in the output section. Now, I thought I would finish off with an Azure Data Factory demo in this section using one that I'd actually used for a demo elsewhere previously. And this is within a Azure Data Factory Studio. So here you have your home hub, and everything on the left hand side here, by the way, is called a hub. Here you have your author hub here. So as you can see, it's a bit busy at the moment. So let me minimize. So you basically, if I close this off here, you have your pipelines where you would start doing your various activities within a pipeline. And as you can see, I've got one already here. And this one basically calls a data flow. And you have data sets here, and that's basically the data you intend to use in your various pipelines, for example. And then moving on from there, you've got data flows, which is new-ish in Azure Data Factory to a degree. And this is probably looks very familiar to those of you with a SQL Server background who've worked with integration services in the past, and you basically use these data flows to do your transformations. And then you've got Power Query, which is actually currently in preview, and that's essentially using a similar kind of idea as Power Query that you use in Power BI. And then you can have templates as well. Now you can monitor the jobs that have taken place in Azure Data Factory in the monitor section, whether that's through a pipeline run, so basically if you've run it manually, or a trigger run. And other things you can monitor here as well. And then finally, there's a manage hub. And here you manage your things like your linked services. So here, this is where you would connect to all your various services, whether they're in Azure or whether they're hosted somewhere else, for example, on premises. And then an integration runtime section. This is where you manage what's known as your integration runtimes in Azure Data Factory, and these are used to process a lot of the tasks that you create. And you can have these hosted in various places, including in Azure, and you can also have what's called self-hosted integration runtimes as well, which is quite a common practice if you have data sources on premises. So basically you'd install an integration runtime on the server somewhere on premises as well. That would essentially act as a person in the middle between your data sources on premises and your Azure Data Factory service. Now, as you can see in the source control section, you can actually configure Git integration configuration as well. So for example, if you have an Azure repo service somewhere in Azure DevOps, you can actually connect this Azure Data Factory service directly to it. And you can generate ARM templates as well. And there's a few other things relating to the author and security settings as well. And that is a very short introduction to Azure Data Factory Studio. And of course, not all of, but some of the services relating to ingesting data. Now, a very common thing that's done with data that has been ingested through either Azure Stream Analytics or Azure Data Factory is that it's then stored in Azure Data Lake Storage. Now, there's actually two generations of Azure Data Lake Storage available, called Gen 1 and Gen 2. Now, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 1 is still commonly used in a lot of places, and in fact you can still install it in Azure Portal. And in addition to that, Gen 2 is becoming a lot more popular because of business needs, mostly due to the fact it supports hierarchical namespaces. In other words, it supports folders. And I can actually show you now where you would tend to go and install it. So whereas with Gen 1 you install directly through the portal, you tend to set up Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2 when you create a storage account. And you actually enable hierarchical namespaces here, and that will set up Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. How does that look? Well, if we go into Storage Explorer, you can see I've actually got a container created called raw to put in all the raw data that's been processed through Stream Analytics or Azure Data Factory. And I've created some subfolders for the data to go into to represent the different sources. And then from there, the data can be effectively cleansed, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And you can have a folder there to contain your source of truth. And then in another container, I've created a subfolder to represent data that has been aggregated, which you may want to show to the business, for example, through using Power BI. Now, here's where things get a bit interesting, because now we're going to be dealing with some blurred lines. As you can see in this diagram, you can use one of two different services to prepare and train your data. And in reality, you can actually use either of those services to a degree to model and serve the data as well. So for example, you could have data going straight from Azure Databricks to Power BI. So with this in mind, I think I'm going to rename this section. So bear with me and I'll be right back. Well, thanks for sticking with me, everybody. And as you can see, I've renamed this stage to be the multitasking stage. And I've done this because in the past, Azure Databricks was the recommended service to be used to prepare and train the data. And Azure Synapse Analytics was mostly being recommended as part of the model and serve stage. However, the lines are now becoming a bit blurred, with both of the services being recommended to do many things, including potentially both being used to do long-term storage. Now, before I go too far into all of this, let me introduce both services first. So, Azure Databricks is the Azure hosted version of the popular Databricks service. You can think of Databricks as a front layer that you use to work with data on Spark clusters behind the scenes. Those of you with a SQL Server background can think of Spark clusters as in-memory OLTP spread across multiple machines. However, in reality, it's a bit more complicated than that. And I can actually show you here where you go to orchestrate your various clusters. So for example, I have a test one that I created earlier, and what I can actually do is turn it on, because we will use it again shortly. Anyway, if we go to create a cluster here, I can actually scroll down. You can see we got some various options for how we deploy these clusters that are used behind the scenes. This includes the software that's run on the cluster, and in addition to that, what version of virtual machine the worker types will be as well, in addition to some other settings. And a top tip when you start working out with Azure Databricks, you might want to reduce this number depending on what material you're using for training purposes. And if I scroll down a bit further, it gives me estimated costs, etc. Anyway, one good thing about using Azure Databricks is that it ties in with the Azure RBAC model, and it allows people to share code and compute, so they can do various things such as big data analytics. And a common use for Databricks is to read large amounts of data stored in Azure Data Lake storage and then do various things with it, like the analytics we were just talking about and advanced transformations as well. And it tends to do all of this by using notebooks. So if I click on Workspace here and click on Shared, I'm just going to click on here and I'm just going to quickly show you the different types of languages that these notebooks can support. So basically, they can support Python, Scala, SQL, or R. And if I open up one I created earlier, these notebooks might look very familiar to those of you who have used some other services in Azure, and in addition, anybody who's used Azure Data Studio, which is an alternative to SQL Server Management Studio. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these notebooks support 4 different language types. However, whilst you're working in the different cells inside these notebooks, you can actually use a different language type inside a cell by using what is known as magic. Now, just to be clear, that's not the kind of magic that Santa uses, but it's actually a special command. And you do this by putting a % sign inside in the front of whichever language you want to swap it to instead. And as you can see here, this cell has changed from using Python to SQL, and I can actually click to run the command now. And those of you with a SQL Server background will realize this is a very basic select statement. And if I show the result, there you go. And in reality, the SQL you use will be a bit more complicated than that. Usually what you tend to do in Databricks, you will tend to query the write your SQL or write your Python commands or whatever. And you will actually create what's known as logical tables, essentially, on top of the data that you've got stored in data lake storage or anywhere else. And for those of you with a SQL Server background, you can think of these constructs you create in Databricks a similar way as you think of views in SQL Server. There is just a logical layer on top. And then what you do, you use your language of choice, whether it's Python or SQL or whatever, to actually query this logical table that you have created in Databricks. And then from there, you can do a whole range of very complex tasks, depending on which language you use. You can do very deep machine learning. You can use Python to do very advanced transformations that are required. Or, of course, you can run select statements against the data for analysis. And that's a very brief overview of what you can potentially do in these notebooks. If I was to go through everything that you could potentially do inside them in Azure Databricks, this video would be a lot longer. So I'm not going to go through every single thing here. Now, as you can see on the left hand side here, there's various things that you can do as well in your Databricks workspace. And we've already seen you can manage your clusters in the compute section. You can use data, so you can create those tables I was talking about earlier inside here instead. And you can actually import data into the database file system as well, or file store, if you want to as well. And you can see there's an upload button, so if you've got files stored locally on your computer, for example, you can upload them into the Databricks file store. You can also schedule jobs in the jobs section as well, and then there's settings, which can be quite useful as well. However, I'm not going to dive too deeply into them because this is an overview video. Now, you can actually change your workbook to do different things here. This is set for data science and engineering at the moment. I could go to machine learning, for example, to work with the more advanced machine learning capabilities. Or, as I mentioned earlier, you can work with Databricks SQL as well. Now, be aware, you can only use this if you're using the premium tier, which yours truly is paid out for this video. So, in Databricks SQL, as you can see, you can do various things on here to work with SQL commands to get data out of whatever you've got in what I would call a data lake, but I will explain a bit more about this shortly as well. So, as I mentioned, essentially Databricks is actually promoting a new paradigm called a lakehouse, which is basically a combination of a traditional data lake and a data warehouse. So what they're saying is that you can use Databricks to work with large files inside a data lake and use it as long-term storage as well. Now, to help with this, they actually use something called a Delta Lake, which is actually something that's you can think of as kind of nested inside the data lake service. And this Delta Lake introduces ACID properties to the work you do inside your data lake. So basically, to help with some jargon here, ACID stands for atomicity, consistency, reliability, and durability. And the term ACID is probably very familiar to those of you with a SQL Server background, because that's how you keep your transactions consistent in SQL Server. And it's pretty much a similar concept in Databricks as well when you use a Delta Lake. And I say Databricks, you can work with Delta Lake in Azure Synapse Analytics to a degree as well. And this transaction log, like I said, it keeps track of the changes to all the files that you have stored inside your effectively Delta Lake. And this helps keep the data consistent. Plus, it also allows you to see how the data was at a certain point in time. And because it keeps track of all your data changes, of course, it's going to keep auditors happy. So that's why I thought I would just quickly show you how Databricks SQL actually looks here before we move over to Azure Synapse Analytics. So this is actually Synapse Studio, which comes with Azure Synapse Analytics. So basically with Azure Synapse Analytics, you would create a workspace to work with, and then once you've created your workspace, you'll be able to use this studio. Now, Azure Synapse Analytics is a fully integrated service developed by Microsoft, and its ambition is to provide data ingestion, big data analytics, and data warehousing, all under one roof within one big integrated service. And this is to save you having to use multiple services. For example, traditionally you would use Azure Data Factory to ingest data via pipelines, as we went through earlier in this video. And then you would use Azure Databricks to perform powerful analytics on that data using Spark clusters, a topic which we actually just covered. And then finally, traditionally you would have used a service in the past called Azure SQL Data Warehouse to store a historic copy of that data. Now, they are offering you the opportunity to do all three within one service, which is Azure Synapse Analytics. It can ingest data by using its own pipeline functionality or by using Azure Data Factory. And in fact, the pipeline functionality in Azure Synapse Analytics and Azure Data Factory are very similar. The one big difference is that you cannot use SSIS integration runtimes in Azure Synapse Analytics. And as I mentioned, I think earlier in the video, basic SSIS integration runtimes are special runtimes that you can install with Azure Data Factory so that you can work with the traditional SQL Server integration services packages. Now, you can also ingest data from a couple of other services in near real time as well. And something that Microsoft are introducing in Azure Synapse Analytics to do this is called Azure Synapse Link. And at this moment in time, it works with Azure Cosmos DB, and it was announced recently at night as well that they were looking to get it working with Microsoft Dataverse as well. And this Azure Synapse Link will actually be supported in SQL Server 2022. So I'm sure a lot of SQL Server professionals watching this video will be keen to look into it a bit more. Now, as far as big data analytics is concerned, Azure Synapse comes with its own way to work with Apache Spark Pools. And finally, as far as long-term storage is concerned, Azure Synapse has a couple of interesting options called SQL Pools. Now, there are currently two types of SQL Pools that you can use, and they both support the T-SQL syntax that you use with SQL Server to a degree. So people with SQL Server experience can adapt to them easier. Now, the first one is dedicated SQL Pools, which actually used to be a separate service called Azure SQL Data Warehouse, and is now integrated into Azure Synapse Analytics. Now, these dedicated SQL pools use what is known as multi-parallel processing. It basically means that when you work with the data in these SQL pools behind the scenes, it's split up so that it can be worked on multiple nodes behind the scenes. In fact, the default number, if you choose the lowest amount of units for a pool, is 60 nodes at this moment in time, if I remember correctly. Now, there are some advantages to using dedicated SQL pools as well. For example, for larger tables that you work with, you can implement a form of hashing to distribute the data more evenly amongst these nodes that are being used behind the scenes. And that can speed up, say for example, if you're querying for a particular range or a particular item, it can speed up query some. So you can think of it a bit like more of a pinpoint way to query data that's been distributed on these nodes. In addition to that as well, if you've got smaller tables, for example, like a reference table, which has only got 10 or 20 rows in it, you can actually replicate those tables amongst all of those nodes behind the scenes, which will speed up any queries that you use joins in, because obviously instead of having to go and talk to another node to get the data for another table, it will all be on the same node. Now, the second type of SQL pool that you can use is a serverless SQL pool. And you can think of these serverless SQL pools as Spark pools that run T-SQL syntax. And they can be used to analyze the data stored in Azure Data Lake storage, or they can be used to create a logical data warehouse as well. So as you can probably guess from the statement I just said, and from a little bit before then as well, basically you can also look to use the Lakehouse paradigm in Azure Synapse Analytics as well. Now, previously I wrote a post that was called a 5-minute crash course to Synapse Studio, because that's how long the estimated reading time for it was. So, it's going to be very interesting to see how long it takes to do in video form. So let's have a look and see if we can actually do that now. So, as I mentioned earlier, this is Synapse Studio, and it is effectively a studio that you can use on top of Azure Synapse Analytics. And here on the home page, as you can see, we've got certain options already. We've got ingest, where we can go through to run a copy data tool. We've also got visualize, so if I click on there, it will look to connect me up to Power BI, so I can work with Power BI reports actually inside Synapse Studio, which is quite convenient and means that potentially if you're working for a company that has a, let's just say, interesting process for you to be able to use Power BI desktop, you can potentially look to use Synapse Studio instead if you want to. And if I scroll down, I can access things like the Knowledge Center, etc. Now, leading on from there, I can click on Data Hub. So all of these things you see on the left-hand side here are actually called hubs. And here you can see all of your databases that you've got set up in Synapse Studio. And apparently a rogue pipeline that I opened up as well. So as you can see, I've already got some linked data sources already set up. And if I want to, I can actually click on the plus sign to create more items here as well. Now, moving on from there, if I click on the Develop Hub, this is where you tend to work on all your development scripts, etc. For example, SQL Server scripts and notebooks, as you can see on the left-hand side. And as I mentioned just now, another interesting point is that you can connect it to Power BI workspaces as well. So, and if I click on the plus sign, you can see all the additional things that I can work with on here now, including SQL scripts, KQL, notebooks, data flows, etc., etc. So, moving on from there, we then have the Integrate Hub. And this is essentially where you work with pipelines in Azure Synapse Analytics. So, for example, if I click on here and go to Pipeline, you will see a very familiar layout up here, and I can just hide the properties section for you here. And as you can all see, this is very similar to how you work with pipelines in Azure Data Factory. And again, if I click on the plus side here, you can see there's a few other things I can do in the Integrate Hub as well, including browse galleries so that I can have pre-written templates for pipelines and put them in. Then there's a monitor section that's here as well, so I can monitor performance, for example, what's going on in my pools. Also various activities that are taking place as well. And also certain things like the pipeline runs, trigger runs, and runtimes, etc., which are similar to how you'd monitor things in Azure Data Factory. And then finally, there's the Manage section. And then you can manage your pools at the top here, whether it's SQL, Apache Spark, or Data Explorer, which is currently in preview. I can manage my linked services exactly the same as how I manage linked services in Azure Data Factory here. And as you can see, you actually have to have a linked service created to connect at the Power BI. Bit of an interesting tip for some of you as well. All of these are actually JSON behind the scenes. So for example, if you have issues connecting up to a Power BI service, which you access using another account, so you use a completely different Microsoft tenant to connect up to it, you can actually change the JSON behind the scenes and put in your details for your other Power BI account in that JSON, and then when you actually go to access your Power BI reports that you use behind that linked service, you'll then be challenged for the credentials to put in. So just a little bit of advice for you all in there, and there is actually, again, another blog post I wrote called Nifty Power BI Fix, which you can search for using your search engine of choice to find that goes through the process of doing that. Now, there's integration with Azure Purview as well, which is something that I will discuss towards the end of this video, but it is a really good thing to look into for your data governance, basically. And of course, there's the triggers and integration runtimes that I can manage here as well. In addition, various security settings, which for various reasons I'm not going to click on in this video. Manage certain packages that you've created, and then finally manage the Git integration, which you can see I've already done at the top here. And that effectively means that if I have a Git repository set up somewhere, like in Azure Repos within Azure DevOps, I can actually store a Git repository based on the contents of my Azure Synapse workspace, which is quite useful and actually makes it easier if I want to, for example, develop in a test workspace in a test environment and then have those changes replicated to an Azure Synapse workspace that's in a production environment. I can do that easily using Azure pipelines if I've got it stored inside a repository in Azure DevOps. So that actually concludes the crash course there about Synapse Studio. And now I've gone through both of these products, you can probably understand why I'm saying there's some blurred lines here, because both are now offering services that were associated with the other one in the past. And in addition to that, both of them can be used with the new Lakehouse paradigm. And there's quite a few good resources about the new Lakehouse paradigm online. Before I finish this video, I will give a couple of honourable mentions to some other services in Azure. By the way, in case anybody's wondering about why the letter U has appeared in the word honourable, I'm British and this is the British spelling for it. Anyway, let's carry on. First of all, there is Apache Kafka, which is an alternative streaming platform. Then there's Azure Data Explorer, which can be used to perform data analytics on large volumes of streaming data. Now, as you may have noticed earlier when I was covering Azure Synapse Analytics, Data Explorer pools are currently in preview within Azure Synapse Analytics Workspace. And the reason I didn't go into too much detail about them is because they are currently in preview. Next, there is Azure Cosmos DB, which is a multi-model database service offered by Microsoft, and it supports APIs for SQL, MongoDB, Gremlin, Cassandra, and Azure Table Storage. It's worth looking into if you want high consistency and you want your data to have semi-structured data. Next up is Azure Purview, which is a fairly new service to handle data governance introduced by Microsoft. Then there's Azure SQL, which is the name for the collective SQL Server related services in Azure, including SQL Server on Azure Virtual Machines, Azure SQL Managed Instance, Azure SQL Database, and Azure SQL Edge. And I'm getting a bit of deja vu listing these, as if I've recorded a video relating to these SQL Server related services in Azure before. Next up is HD Insight, which is an older Azure-based big data solution, which is actually based on Hadoop. And finally, there's Power BI, which can be used to visualize data from a fair few of the services that I have covered in this video. Interesting fact for some of you, many years ago I was an advocate of using some of the features in Power BI, like Power View, before Power BI actually became a thing. Now, I could mention the whole whether to use analysis services or Power BI Premium debate, but I think I will leave that for others to discuss. And that is the end of my honourable mentions. And in fact, we are coming up to the end of the video. For those of you who don't want to see the alternative bio, feel free to leave now. Thank you very much for watching. Right, so we're coming towards the end of this video. So, as promised, here is my alternative bio for all of you. So, first things first, because I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, I get to enjoy two festive celebrations in December. I get to enjoy Sinterklaas on December the 5th and Christmas Day on December the 25th. And I can vouch for the fact that whenever I visit my niece and nephew in the UK around December the 25th, they celebrate Sinterklaas as well. Well, at least they enjoy the chocolate they get in their shoes for it anyway. Now, because I'm originally from the UK, I'm still getting used to calling December the 26th Second Christmas, because in the UK we call it Boxing Day. Now, little known fact is that on Christmas Day I tend to cook an English Christmas dinner here in the Netherlands, using ingredients that I'm luckily able to find over here. And that probably explains why both my mother and my mother-in-law enjoy coming over so much for Christmas Day. However, I suspect that could be more to do with my roast potatoes as well, because I tend to cook well-done roast potatoes of a generous size. Anyway, some other facts about me include the fact that I was once Santa. So, as I'm sure some of your children will probably tell you, Santa Claus is somebody who is very full of life. And he obviously enjoys life a lot, because one year he enjoyed a late night so much he couldn't attend the children's nursery the following day. So I agreed to step in and take his place. And because this was a different part of the UK than where I'm originally from, it's probably the first ever time a lot of those children heard how Santa Claus would sound with a Somerset accent. Now, in addition to that, I once actually had 3 Christmas dinners, due to circumstances that are probably too long and complicated to explain in this video. However, it's safe to say that by the 3rd Christmas dinner, I was feeling fairly full. And 3 must be a kind of lucky number, because this is the 3rd year in a row that I've actually done one of these presentations for this calendar series, with the first one being the SQL Server related services in Azure video, which I kind of joked about a bit earlier. And finally, I've already donated to Girls Who Code. And I'm hoping, because this is the festive period, that some of you watching this video will also do the same. So, after of course watching the end of this festive bio, please go on to the Festive Tech Calendar website and click on the link for the Just Giving page for Girls Who Code and donate on there. Now, if you do go to donate, you can actually write some messages as well. And these messages can be whatever you feel like writing. So it could be, for example, to thank the organisers. It could be to thank all the people that are involved in the different videos that you've watched and the blog posts that you've read. It could be anything at all. And on that note, everybody, this is actually the end of the video. So all that's left for me to say is thank you very much for watching this video. Obviously, a big thanks to the organisers as well for organising this. And as I mentioned just now, please donate to Girls Who Code. Thank you very much, and goodbye.